My name is Susan Tilson. I am here today. It's September 14th, 2023. I'm here at the apartment of Serena Wieder in New York City to interview her about her Holocaust experiences and afterwards. And this interview will be conducted in English. My name is Susan Tilson. I am here today, September 14th, 2023, to interview Holocaust survivor Serena Wieder at her apartment in New York City. And this interview will be conducted in English. Good morning. Can you please just state your name and spell it for us?
Serena Wieder, that's SERENAWIEDER.
And that was your name at birth?
Yes.
Did you have any nicknames as a child?
Well, in Romanian it's Surica, and it's also Serena. But Surica is, my childhood name, because my Hebrew name is Sarah, and it comes from Surica. It turned into Surica.
And when were you born?
November 28th, 1943.
So that makes you...
I'll be 80 next month, in 2 months.
Big birthday. In what city and country were you born?
I was born in Arad, Romania. It's a small city, not far from the Hungarian border, at the foot of Transylvania.
And what were the names of your parents?
My mother's name was Lenka Wieder, Lenka, and my father was Martin Wieder. He had several names, but when he came to America, it became Martin.
And your mother's maiden name?
Nemeth.
Can you spell that for me?
Nemeth.
Siblings of yours?
I have an older sister. Her name is Hetty Steele. And she's 5 years older than I am. And a younger brother, 3 years younger. His name is David Wieder. And he resides in Miami. And my sister, sadly, is in a dementia nursing home unit right now following COVID, and a decline that started earlier, which runs in the family.
And there was another sibling.
Yes. My sister was the oldest, and then my parents had a son whom they named for my father's father, and he died during the war. He was actually suffocated by a piece of gauze that the servant had put in his mouth to stop his crying. This was during the German occupation of Arad, and my father was in the labor camps. He was able to come back, and that was a very sad situation. My mother was working in the marketplace, and he always wondered about what would have happened if she wasn't there, and if she were home, and if she could nurse him. It was a different time, a very dark time, but then my mother got pregnant again, and I was born.
What did your father and mother do for a living before the war?
Well, my mother worked with her mother. I'll tell that story. But basically, my grandmother sold geese in the marketplace in Arad. She also had a bodega. She was a very good cook. And she would create this amazing pastrami from the geese. And, she came to Arad, alone. She had a sister there. It was after her husband died during the Spanish influenza. And just built herself up, and was successful. She was a very smart woman. She came. My mother and her older sister, whose name was Serena, were left with her parents in a small shtetl in Mikhev, and she brought them to Arad, and that's where they grew up. My mother must have been probably about 3 at the time.
So let's talk about sort of before the war, your family's history, so that survival, really, even long before the Holocaust. Can you tell us about your family story, especially your maternal grandfather, and what happened to him during the First World War?
Yeah, well, I think every Holocaust story has other stories. There's always a before and an after. And in our case, um, both my parents came from these small little Städtler. I don't know anything about my grandfather, my mother's father, which is very sad. I have spent a lot of time searching for it at different genealogy sites. All I know was that he was a very tall man. And when World War I broke out, the war was between Austro-Hungary, right, and what then became the Allies. And they were just, the part of Romania we were in was Austro-Hungary. It wasn't Romania at the time. And, I guess they just swept up people they thought would be good soldiers, wherever they were. And he was swept up that way and was in the army. And towards the end of the war is when the Spanish flu occurred. And they had 4 children, actually 5 at the time. And 4 of the children died. He was able to get leave. He came back to their little place, and then he got sick. But my grandmother did get pregnant, and my mother was born after he died. And there was, I said, one other child. It was her sister, who was a few years older. So my grandmother was just left, on her own with these 2 little babies, little girls, and had no way of supporting herself. And she went to the Rebbe. I come from a very Hasidic family, one in which you don't make any moves until you ask the Rebbe. And she went there, totally bereft and in grief, and, what am I going to do? Everyone was very poor at the time. And he said, who was in your family? And she told him she had a sister in Arad. I don't know when her sister went there. I do know about her sister and her children. It's another story. So he said, leave your children with your parents, go there, sleep on the kitchen floor, do anything, and find work. And so she landed up in the marketplace working, and I don't know if she worked for someone who also sold geese, but that's what she took on. And just worked very hard, and was successful in the sense she could save money and finally got her own place to live, and then got a better place to live. And my aunt went to school, and she was the smart one. And she actually went to the gymnasium. She finished 8th grade and went to the gymnasium. My mother went to school until the 8th grade and was not considered, so smart to go to gymnasium, but she was very good at math. She could add numbers. So that was very useful in a marketplace where, you didn't have adding machines. You just had to add the numbers and weigh the geese and so on. So from that day on, she worked with her mother till the very last day, until we left Arad. And my grandmother became a leader in the community. She buried all her money and her gold underneath the floor of the shul, thinking, that she would retrieve it. It's hard to say. I actually, when I was 16, I quit high school and I went to Israel so I could meet her and meet my other grandmother. I was totally absorbed in getting to know the family. I did have one aunt in America, but that's not where the story was for our family. So all the survivors actually, besides us, went to Israel, the long way through Cyprus, through the war. Many stories about that. And so I did get to meet her. And it was hard to communicate with her. She at the time was already showing what we then called senility. And I remember I was going to live with her, and I was going to go to Beis Yaakov Seminary. I don't know if you know, Beis Yaakov is the most orthodox Jewish educational system for women, which started out, really remarkably by a woman called Sarah Schneer, who felt girls had to be trained and educated and, be able to help support the family or their husbands, whatever, learning. So I picked the most right-wing school in Bnei Brak. And I lived with her. What happened before then, we came to America in 1948. Let me skip over. 10 years later, or 9 years later, in 1957, my sister got married. And we tried to bring my grandmother over to come to the wedding. My grandmother got to Israel in the early 50s. There was an arrangement with the Jewish organizations that if they gave $1,000 per head, they would release that person. And what do they need? This old woman, in Romania. But they made a lot of money. I don't know how many people were released that way. And she got to Israel, and they sent her off to Tzfat, Tzfat, And, she was living in this cold stone house, no water, no electricity, and nothing with her, of course. They found the money and the gold and all that. So between our arrival in America and this wedding, a lot happened with my mother, and I'll tell you about that in a while. But she did go to Israel in 1957 with my younger brother to see her mother. And it was their first reunion and their last meeting. My father, and she came back. I stayed with my father. We had a little grocery store, in the Bronx. We had several grocery stores in the Bronx. And I stayed and worked in the store with my father. It was right here. I went to school at PS 70, and it was at the corner of the store. And while my brother was away, my sister was married, I'd work in the store and then go to the public school where they had a pool and, some activities. The next year, of course, my father wanted to go. So I stayed with my mother in the grocery store. She needed more help, more work. And he went for a much shorter trip. Now, back then, what you would do is go by ship. Israel at that point had two ships, the SS Israel and the SS Zion. And that was really important because it meant you could take many, many suitcases and boxes. This was a period of recession in Israel. It was very hard, very poor. And, my father did anything he could to send them, like one of my uncles had a seltzer factory, and sent him bottles and, sent money to get a little refrigerator. And I remember we still sent packages of food, And he went, things were beginning to get better. And he had a reunion with 4 of his brothers, all alive. 2 had gotten to Israel in 1936 and 1937 when my grandparents, his parents, went to Israel. And then the 2 that survived the war and survived Auschwitz went to Israel after the war. And it was quite remarkable. And when my father saw what was going on, it was the time that we are Hasidei Vishnitz. And they were just starting their own community right on the edge of Bnei Brak. And he bought my grandmother a little apartment. There were just a bunch of little houses. And it was only one room and a little corner kitchen, but it had a front yard where she could grow flowers, a little backyard, and it was right near the yeshiva. And she would listen to the men learning, and actually, I was told by several people, she sat there and took out a Gemara, a Talmud, and would sit and listen and learn. I don't think, there was a time she could ever since, without struggling for her own survival. So that was a huge, huge gift. He also bought her a place to be buried. I think you know the tradition. There's a very important tradition where people want to know where they're going to be put to rest. And they go to that place and they pray at that place before they're even buried. And I went to live with her, in that one room. And I was young, I was 16. It was a little scary because at night she would take candles and run through the orchards. At those times, it was surrounded by orchards. Today, if you saw it, you would know, there was a tree that ever existed there, except, the ones on the street, to go to this place that she would be buried. And my father bought two places, one for his mother and one for her mother, foot to foot. It's called an ohel. Ohel means tent, but it's at the building that would surround the place where the Rebbe was buried. An extremely, great honor and foretelling of the world to come. And, I bet people will want those places now. They always have. So both my grandmothers are buried foot to foot there. And he didn't stay too long. In fact, he, took a plane from there to Belgium. It was actually the year of the World's Fair in Belgium. And from there he went to France and took a ship, the Queen Elizabeth, to America. So it was too dangerous to cross the Atlantic, in one ship. So that was in 1958. So in 1960, I decided it was my turn.
Can we go all the way back?
Yes.
To
my mother, right?
Your mother, your father, the experiences both before the war and
right.
You're born in 1943, right? So the war is
right. So as I said, my grandmother moved to Arad. She was able to support her children. She was able to get them, create a nice home where I was actually born later, and that was pretty much it. My mother actually was engaged, but that engagement didn't work out. Got complicated with her sister's interests, and waited to get married and work in the market. My father was born not too far away in a little town called Barsha, a shtetl, a very small shtetl. It was at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains, and it was actually a fairly peaceful place until pogroms were incited. His father, as I think I told you before, was married 3 times. His first wife did not have any children. They did not have any children. He married again and had 3 children. And then she died, and he married her sister, and she had 7 children. He sold seltzer, but he was actually more than that. He was a great, great tzaddik. In fact, a new book is coming out shortly, just about his life, and he appears in all the books of Chassidut, of the Chassidim of the time. He'd get up 4 a.m. on Friday to go leave, food for the widows for Shabbat. And, he was someone people turned to, very close to the rabbis, the grand rabbis. And
can you explain what a tzaddik is?
A tzaddik is a righteous man. There are many stories about how the Jewish world continues because of these righteous people, the 36 righteous, you may have heard of that. But he was a truly righteous person who really just cared for his fellow man and of deep, deep faith. I don't know too much about his story, but in this book, a cousin, actually a grandson of my first cousin, traveled back to Romania, and he, especially Ukraine, because that part now is Ukraine, and he found tombstones of our family from 1856 and more. And I've been corresponding with him because he, of course, wanted to know our story, and my father's connection to his father, to the Rebbe's. So there'll be more to tell about that. But he was 23 years older than my grandmother, and his son, this was his fourth son, had decided to go to Israel in 1936 when it was still possible to get in under the British mandate. And he got married in Romania and went to Israel. And my father too, they were part of this Chalutz movement. It was, the early days of Zionism, and we all had to learn how to work the land. And he was in one of those Chalutzim. Chalutzim is a pioneer. And he also got a certificate to go to Israel, but he gave it to his father, to his parents, so they could go. He was very elderly, and they prepared to go to Israel. And, when they left, the whole town of Barsha came out to bid them farewell, because he was a very special part of that community. But he said he won't leave until my father was married, because at that point, my father couldn't go. His youngest brother went with his parents. The certificate allowed like a couple, and if they had a child, to come. And he didn't live very long in Israel. He got ill, and he was buried in Mount Olives, Har Zaitim. I don't know if you know the tradition, but children in the Hasidic world don't actually, at least back then, bury their parents. The grief is too great, it's done by the minyan, the kahila. And he was taken at night, in the darkness, to the Mount of Olives. And what was just so miraculous was, it wasn't acceptable after 1948 when Jordan took over that area of Mount Olives and Jerusalem. And they built a road in that part of the cemetery, going up to the hilltop there. And the stones we used to build, pave the roads. And his stone actually did fall off, but it didn't break. And after the war, they found it. And it was really amazing. So they rebuilt, of course, the stone. They built another stone on top of it to list all the people of the Shoah, all his children that died, that were burdened and perished. And today, my father bought plots right near there, and now my parents are buried right nearby, as is another uncle. So my father, he grew up in this lovely little town, until 8th grade. He went to the local yeshiva, and then it's time to be sent off to the next yeshiva and the next yeshiva. The tradition was you'd be going to these other villages or shtetl or little cities where, you would be taken in for a meal. Every day you had a meal at a different place. These were the bachrim, the young men who had to be fed. I mean, you may have had a place to sleep, but you didn't have a place to eat. And, and actually these journeys, led him to really want to know the family as well. And he started to, travel around, and he was a very active and joyful and a wonderful chazan. He was able to sing well, and he, kept up with the times. That's how he became a pioneer. But it wasn't so simple. In the early 30s in Romania, it started to turn fascist. There were the brown shirts. There were inciting pogroms. One of them actually burnt the city of Barsha down. And my father and some of his peers started to try to fight. It was led by a university student called Daniello. And in the end, they arrested Daniello, but they also arrested my father and his peers, and they went on trial. And they were both acquitted. My father's group was acquitted, but so was Daniello. So the trouble didn't stop. This quiet, peaceful town really became the site of many attacks, many hardships, and that is why, in part, one of my uncles decided to go to Israel as well. It was also when my father, as I said, you don't do anything. You don't do anything without asking the rabbi. And he had an appendicitis attack, and he had to go to the hospital, and that was a very dangerous thing to have surgery in those days. And the Rebbe went with him and said, I will stand at the door and pray. And he survived. And then he was drafted. This was before he got married. He was drafted into the army. And this now is the Romanian army. So historically what happened is Austro-Hungary was defeated. All of Eastern Europe was kind of divided, cut up into all these different countries. Romania was expanded, took over Transylvania. It was a kingdom, and it was led by King Carol. He was the king after World War I. And they had an army. They had a big army. Now, Romania, I mean, this is kind of a paradox. Romania was a country that had so many natural resources that everyone wanted to be on the Romanian side. What happened was, so he was drafted into the army like many more. I mean, they had 1 million soldiers. No, 100,000, I think. That came a little later when they switched sides. King Carol was actually a supporter of the Jews. And he, when they were forced to put on the yellow stars, he put one on. And it is said that one of his mistresses was Jewish. But there was a fascist leader. His name was Antonescu, and the fascist forces became stronger. King Carol abdicated, and the rest of the story moves to when Antonescu became allies with the Nazis. And while the Nazis came to the they would not recognize Romania proper. That was the re-bordered area of Romania after World War I. So as far as they were concerned, anything that was Austro-Hungary was theirs. And that's when they actually went into the Stadtlach. Sighet and Barsha and, Vishev, and just one after the other. And that's when our family was taken away. One of the towns, which was Sighet, is where one of the places my father actually went to, and that's where he actually met Elie Wiesel. Later, they landed up in a similar labor camp before Wiesel and his father were sent to Auschwitz. But so that whole family went first, but it went late. Elie Wiesel, in his biography, describes better than anyone I know what was happening then. Nobody would believe what was happening. They knew about the camps. They knew about the ghettos. They knew about, what was happening in Poland, in Warsaw, in Krakow, and all these places. They just didn't believe it would come to them. And, he writes of a man who came to warn them, and they thought he was crazy, and they didn't listen. So they were taken away, as were, my uncles and aunts, and, I'll show you some of the pictures. But we were in Romania proper. Arad was in what was Romania before World War I. So the Germans didn't yet move in there. They got there, I'm afraid, but they didn't move in yet to take people to the camps. And they got to Romania in the 40s, into Arad, because I know one of the things I found is there was a census taken in 1942 of the Jews of Arad. And I don't know if this is the reason why, but I assume they wanted the lists. They wanted the lists of the Jews. And part of the list was to identify all the men, because they were taking the men first to send them off. And my father didn't even know about this. I discovered this, when I was doing research. And for some reason, they never sent those men off. So my father was sent to a labor camp. And to get back to his marriage to my mother, which happened in like 3 weeks. He saw that he could not work with my grandmother and my mother selling geese, and he found a way to get his own table at the marketplace, and he started selling textiles, imported textiles from Italy. You have to remember how close these countries are. I mean, they're just hours away, And he sold textiles. And there he actually got to meet a lot of the soldiers and the police. In Romania, you had to make your own uniforms. And to make your own uniforms, you had to buy fabric. And they came to the market to buy fabric. And my father had this uncanny gift to kind of become friendly with them, to give them gifts. I mean, to his dying day, even today, I'm always giving gifts to whoever's taking care of a family member. And to bribe them, most of all. If you know Romanian reputations, it's a story of you get nowhere without bribery. It's the same corruption. It's not so different today. But he also got to know the people at the labor camp. And he would arrange to get leave, and he came back to Arad. This is how he came back to my brother's, when my brother died. And, he was able to come back several times, always. So he was in touch with the family. So, through having these connections, he also had a Gentile partner, Olga Vidikan, who was really one of those righteous Gentiles. Because, of course, the Jews couldn't have businesses and things like that. I don't think my grandmother had to do it. I think they left alone people selling food, as she did. But Olga kind of kept running the business while he was in the labor camps, and she helped the family. And, when they were running to shelters and hiding, she'd bring them food. In any case, he came back every so often. 3-4 times. I don't mean a lot. It was hard to get away. My mother was pregnant, and she went into premature labor. And I was called a Zibala. Zibala means 7th month. And by the time they went to get the midwife and the doctor, I was out. I assume my grandmother delivered me. At home. Everyone was at home. My father went running through the streets. It was a blackout. It was a German occupation. He ran running like this, to go get help because he was there. And they finally came running, thank God. The Nazis didn't shoot him. And, the doctor said, she's strong, she's breathing. Do not take her to the hospital. She'll die. He said, turn on that furnace, and they had these ceramic ovens that you would fill with wood or coal. And he said, just keep it at, 90 degrees, keep it very, very warm. And I survived. And, during the air raids, there was a shelter. Our apartment house was next to this beautiful corner apartments where there were some shops, but owned by very rich Jews, and they let us come into their shelters, which were well equipped, and Olga would bring us food. And because we were being bombed by the Americans. First the Germans, but the Germans didn't want to destroy Arad. They liked the buildings. They wanted to take it over. Arad was beautiful. It had an opera house. It had, a city hall. And meanwhile, this war is going on. The Romanians are now, King Carol abdicated. They're allies with the Germans. And they let the Germans in. And the deal that King Carol made before he abdicated was, come in, just don't take our people away, and we won't fight you. We'll join you, and that's what happened. Anatesco joined the Nazis, and the Jews in our area were sent to the labor camps. So that was really hard labor. I mean, the stories my father told, they were just given the same thing that happened in Auschwitz and other camps. They were given this hard work to do. Move this pile of stones to this pile of stones and then move it back again. I mean, it was really, really terrible. And, the Germans took a lot of Russian prisoners. And some of them were just so defeated, they decided to drink cement. They just could not bear the starvation, no water, no food. And, the Jews saw them doing this. And they wanted to do it too. I mean, nobody thought they could survive this. Okay, where are the dishes? And this is when, I mentioned my father had a beautiful voice, and he started to sing Ani Maamin. Do you know that prayer? It's a prayer of faith, declaring your Ani Maamin as I believe. That I believe in God, I believe of the coming of the Messiah. I believe. And he just sang it and just was able to stop some of those Jewish, prisoners in the labor camp from drinking cement. And he just had this strength, and he had this vision. He anticipated things. And, meanwhile, we were lucky. We weren't sent away. And he'd come back and he'd want to take care of us. The loss of the son, who was named for his father, was very terrible. And, while never spoken, I know that trauma, was put on my mother. Why weren't you there? The other sad part was my mother's sister got tuberculosis. And I don't know if it was before or after. I actually went to the cemetery, and I do have a picture of her tombstone, but I couldn't find it. But she was very young, half hour away by plane was Switzerland. Penicillin was available. You could be treated for tuberculosis. You could be sent to the mountains. But she died. So here, my mother was the only one left, with her mother. So that was another devastating, trauma. And while I think my mother was jealous of her sister and she was the smart one, what can I say? These two little girls were the survivors of the First War, and it was really very terrible. And then the war now is on. At one point, the Germans were moving in very quickly, and we didn't know what would happen. And my father heard there was a train going east, and he ran home from the market, and he picked my sister and I up and said, "Come, we have to leave. And my grandmother said, "No, the soup is on the table. Sit down and eat." It was really uncanny, to understand how she couldn't really grasp that her life could be devastated again, after the First War. And it's like many other Jews who didn't believe what would happen in their towns, that they were coming, that there would be being sent to these ghettos and camps. She just couldn't absorb that. I tried to talk to her about it, but she couldn't really tell me much. She was a sweet woman. I remember when I went to Israel in 1960, she came to Haifa. I came with 14 suitcases and 10 crates of food I bought in Piraeus, apples and oranges and all the things that weren't there. And the whole family turned out to meet me, This was Mati's daughter coming. And, but we just couldn't communicate very much. My father kept sending her money to my aunt, and then she'd come and get it. And it was okay. I mean, she had a few nice years in Israel, supported, but she didn't have her daughter, and my mother didn't have her mother. So, how did I get there? Oh, yes. So she wouldn't leave. But then my father said, I'm going. And then apparently my mother started running and she started running. And that was just a very short flight. Came back to Arad. The next time, however, the Russians changed sides, right? The Russians were part of the Axis with Germans and, their other allies. And of course, as they took over every country. And I'm sure you all heard about how the Germans tried to take over Stalingrad and move in on Russia, and Russia changed sides and joined the Allies. And in fact, and this is, especially you think about what's happening today, it was the Russians who saved us. The war was escalating, and it was getting worse and worse. The bombings were escalating. And my father heard from one of the people in the marketplace, one of the soldiers or the police, who said, you got to go. There's one more train that's not going to Auschwitz. It was going to head east. And they fled. It was the last train leaving. We all fled with, nothing. And we divided. I was about 2. This was in 1945. My sister was 7. My grandmother came too. And we divided. We stayed in different parts of the train because if the train would be bombed, we shouldn't all get killed at the same time. And the shelling was fierce. And we jumped into the marshes. So there were marshes there. And at this point, Hungary was Germany's, servant. I mean, they were doing worse things than even the Nazis did. So did the Romanians. The Romanians killed 260,000 Jews. Now, these were not the good Romanians. Romania has a confusing history because first they were with the Germans, and then they didn't join the Allies. They just were protected. And Churchill made an agreement with Stalin to give over 90% of Romania, So my sister tells the story. She did remember. The soldiers on that train were Hungarian. And she says she remembers hearing one of the soldiers say, I'm not jumping in there after them. I'm going to get my boots dirty. The Nazis had these fantastic uniforms, all those familiar uniforms. And they were shooting into the marshes, but they weren't going to jump in, Who cares? And frankly, thank God, they didn't want to jump in because that's how we survived. I don't know what happened. I assume the train continued. As I said, these were the Americans bombing. Now, I think you all know about the controversy about why didn't Roosevelt bomb the tracks to Auschwitz. In this case, they weren't bombing to save the Jews. They were bombing the trains to not have them reach the oil fields of Poloshti. And because these were the resources. They had lumber, they had iron, they had, the materials needed for the war. So we fled, and we fled to, it wasn't too far from a farm that one of the servants my parents had in Arad, whose mother had a farm. And her mother was there. And her name was Mariska. Her mother was there. Her father was off in the war. And she let us stay in her barn and waited. So we were, safe there. Of course, the dilemma was there wasn't a lot of food. And every day this woman would give us, in English it's called polenta, but it's mamaliga is the real word. And I don't know, one day, my mother, in her despair said, she couldn't stand the mamaliga anymore. And the woman heard her, and she was very offended and very hurt and threw us out. So we went to Deva, which you could see on the map. It was, again, a small city, which was not occupied. And my father found a room for us to live in, and we waited for the war to be over. And then we were able to go back to Arad, our family together. So that was after the war. And of course, the search for survivors. You see, we searched for my uncles, we searched for our cousin, we searched for whoever made it through the Holocaust. But I wasn't in that Holocaust. We had our own Holocaust, so to speak. And my uncle and aunt came back. This was my father's oldest brother. And they found us. They all went back, as many did. They went back to their homes. And, many of these homes were taken over and, everything they had was stolen. Some people managed to bury some silver or some Sefer Torah. And, but they found us in Arad. We found them, working with this groups, seeking survivors. And then another uncle, the one who I showed you before, who was married and had 5 children, came back alone. And he also went back to Barsha. And Barsha at the time was having a reunion of some of the young people, who survived, just the, young adults and who could, survive those marches, who, survived the terrible endings of the war. And he met a woman, Hadassah, but that wasn't her real name, and at a party, and she had survived only with her sister. Her brother also became one of the workers looking for survivors. And he said, "You're going to Israel." And with the little money they had, he provided them with towels and sheets and some pots and pans. They went back to their home, were not well accepted, as none of these survivors were, because, the Gentiles moved into those homes. But she went to this event in Barsha and met my uncle, and she knew about my uncle. He had a very famous voice, and he had davened in their shuls. And the next morning he came and he said, "Will you marry me?" And there she was. She came back that night. Everything they had was gone. She and her sister, again, with nothing. And she didn't know what to do. And she said, "I will if you'll take my sister with us." And he said, "Of course." And they came to Arad and they got married in our courtyard. And then they took off. At the time, the boats were filling up in Constanza. That's the only port on the Black Sea. This is that sea you can't cross now. And they, of course, could not get into Israel. They were on those ships that were being turned away, and they landed up in Cyprus until the War of Independence was over. We were in Romania. My father continued his textile business. My mother continued working. But guess what? To the Germans, the Jews were communists. To the communists, the Jews were capitalists. And they started rounding people up, included one of my uncles and some others, members of the community, and they were sending them to jail. And my father got word, this was on a Friday, my father got word that he was on the list to be taken because he was a capitalist selling textiles. So he knew it was coming. My father was so resourceful. When the war ended and he saw the communists taking over and he saw the breakdown occurring, he flew to Bucharest to get passports. He was able to get passports, but you couldn't get a visa. Who was going to let more refugees in? And somehow he managed to bribe his way into getting tourist visas for 2 weeks to Belgium. And he came back with passports and those visas. And he was saving them. He also started to send money to Prague, because Prague had one of the biggest refugee communities, and it was a very established organizations, and all the American aid organizations were there. And when he heard that they were coming, they packed 2 suitcases. It was very, very hard for my mother to leave. And my grandmother released her and said, "Go."
Should we take a break?
Okay, let me finish just this part. She said, "Go. You have to go with your family." So we got on the train. Prague was very close. And with our 2 suitcases, got off the train, not knowing, what would happen. And I went to that train station several times. But there were Jews just up and down the tracks saying, "Are you a Jew? Do you need help? come with us. And they got us a room in Hotel Flora. I went to see that too. I'll tell you about my trip back later. And that's where we were. So it was very good, but we only had a tourist visa for Belgium and no visa to stay in Prague, even though we had passports. So what do? You get your papers forged. So they were amazing. They helped us find the forgers, and they changed all our passports, and, they put in some kind of permit that let us stay in Prague. But we had to go get it stamped by the Romanian embassy. And that was, of course, a big risk, because what if they saw that these were forgeries? But what can you do? The Russians were already moving in there, but it was still a democratic country run by President Masaryk. So we went to the embassy, and our turn came, and this officer sitting at the table and looks at the papers, and he said, Weider, did you have a brother Isaac, sister Lily? Did you live in Barsha? And my father his heart sunk. He turned pale. He said, did they telex to the Romanian embassy, look out for these people? And he said, how do you know? And this was the miracle. This officer told him this story. He was 18, and he was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were being spread all over, and he landed up in Barsha, but, there were no barracks, there were no bases, so the soldiers were quartered in different houses. And he met my grandfather on the street. They had to go find someone who would take them in. And my grandfather took him in. And he saw this young, scared 18-year-old kid, and he said, now you come with us. And he lived with the family, and he slept, on this, like concrete oven they had, which kept the house warm, which, where they baked their bread, and he played with the children. But my father was born in 1912, and he didn't remember him. This was about 1914, 15, and he knew the whole family that was, born to that date. And he said, I'll never forget the kindness. Your parents, you'll see his picture. This Hasidic Jew who didn't care if he was Jewish or not. He saw a young, scared soldier and took him in and treated him like a son of the family. Wow. My father said, will you help us? He said, of course I'll help you. Signed all our passports. And then my father said, will you help others? And being a true Romanian, he said, yes. They come to my desk with an envelope on page, 167, and I'll know you sent them. And he helped many other people do what we had to do, which is to get some kind of permit to stay in Prague. I remember Prague. That's where my memories begin. In and out. In fact, all the stories I'm telling you, and will tell you further, I think they're right. They're the stories I heard many times. They're some of the stories I could find in research. But this one I know is very true. So we are in Prague. The Russians are taking over. And Masaryk, we're waiting. We applied to go to Israel, but you couldn't go to Israel. The war broke out in Israel. But we also applied to America. My father had a sister here. And if you know American history, it wasn't very favorable. They turned away the ships, coming with survivors to the war. And then, actually, not so different than now. If you wanted to come to America, you had to have a job. If you had a relative and you had a job, you could come. And my aunt was working, There was so much work going on by the Jewish organizations. And she was able to get my father, an offer of a position at Yeshiva Torah Vodaas. It was one of the bigger yeshivas in Brooklyn, as a rabbi, as a teacher. And I found the letter not long ago saying, "Dear Professor Wieder, we are honored to invite you to come teach our students in our school, and we will pay you whatever. And we await, you're coming with your family." And with this letter, he went to the American embassy. So we were on a list, waiting. Masaryk is assassinated. The Russians are moving in fast. The American embassy has to shut down. And I remember they started to call the people on the list. And they called the hotel. People didn't have phones. And someone from the hotel came running to my mother and said, call your husband immediately. You have to go to the embassy right now. And my sister ran to, my father was in the synagogue saying the evening prayers. My sister ran to get my father. We ran to the embassy. All of us had to appear, and we got visas to America.
Can I take a break?
Yeah.
So we're back from a break. You were telling us about your experience in Prague and how you thankfully got visas to America.
So, again, with a great deal of foresight, we saw what was happening. East Europe was falling. Russians were taking over every country. Czechoslovakia was one of the last to fall. And we certainly, hoped we would get out, whether to Israel, whether to America. And what happened was, my father started to think of, well, we came with 2 suitcases, but we had to have something to take with us. And he started, collecting Bavarian crystal, some of which you see, and China. We couldn't take money, couldn't take gold, couldn't take dollars. So we bought things, and we had a few crates of these objects. So we got ready to leave, but there were gold chains sewn into the hems of our clothes. Oh, I didn't mention my brother was born in 1946. So this journey started, leaving. He wasn't 2 yet. And that was about it, some of the gold. And of course, by putting it on the children, it was a safer thing to do. And we're on the train, and we have the papers, and we're stopped at the border. And they take a look at the family. They made my father get off, and we're standing at the window looking out, and, "Oh, you must be a smuggler. What are you doing with all this stuff?" And, what do you really want to do? And of course, my father said, "Take it all. We don't want any of it. You can have it." Yeah, we can have it. We can have it anyway. What else are you going to give us? What else do you want? And they wanted money. Well, we couldn't show them our money. And my father turned to my mother and he said, "I remember when we boarded the train, there was a Jew from the shul there that had a big scar on his face. Go to him and tell him to give you all the money he has, because, then we'll pay it back. There won't be a problem." And this man gave my mother the money, and she put it out the window and gave it to my father to give to these border police. And they let him go, and the train started to move, and he wasn't on the train. And someone came along and gave him a lift on a horse and caught up. The train was moving very slowly, and he made it, and he got on the train, and we were on our way. And ironically, we actually went through Belgium, went to Paris. And we had to stay in Paris until there was a way to come to America. In those days, the merchant marine ships that were used to bring over all the war materials, of the Americans to the Allies, who, were fighting, they came by ship, They didn't have all these big planes that could take tanks and all these other equipment. And finally, place became available. It was on the Merchant Marine ship. And we went to Lahara and we boarded the ship. Now, this wasn't exactly a luxury ocean, crossing. The women were in one dormitory, the men were another. My brother's birthday was July 2nd. It was his second birthday. We got on July 1st. It took 10 days to cross. And it was very harrowing crossing because there were big storms in the Atlantic. And my father sat and slept by our door just in case. So we made it to America, actually, to appear on the west side right here. It was a Shabbat. My father wouldn't get off this ship, but my aunt met us and we went to a hotel on 104th Street. It doesn't exist anymore. And my father, my aunt went back after Shabbat to get my father and to get our luggage. He didn't want to leave. It was also Shabbat, it was okay for us to go, and the ship wasn't there. So the search, apparently they had moved all the ships. They didn't stay in these piers to Hoboken or somewhere. So we stayed at this hotel for about 8 or 9 months. And they wanted to send us to Milwaukee. Oh, nothing doing. The Vishnitzer Hasidim, the Jewish community was all in Brooklyn and Williamsburg. And, they actually said, we won't be able to help you. We need people there. There are Jews there. But he wasn't going to leave Vishnitz. And my aunt, at that point, she had a 2-room basement apartment, like a kitchen and a room. And it became available and we moved there to the Bronx. So my parents slept in the kitchen, all of us slept in the other room. And my father tried to be a rabbi and teacher, and he couldn't handle it. He tried to work to make hats, because when he was a yeshiva student, my grandparents were very poor, and he saw, the boys were sent off, they had to fend for themselves. And in one of the towns there was a hat maker. And he went and he learned how to make hats. And he brought a machine that made hats back to Barsha, to help my father, to help his father. So he went and he tried to find a job doing that. And that didn't last. And then Passover was coming. And he went to bake matzot. They always needed a lot, so he did that. And then around the corner from where we lived, there was a little Jewish grocery store. Benny Beilis was the owner, and he went to work for Benny Beilis, for $1 a day. And no, it might have been more than that, because it was Passover and it was very busy. And Benny Beilis had decided he was going to sell his store. And he wanted $5,000 for it. And he didn't have a lot of money either. He was also, I'm not sure, a survivor or not. But my father said, I want to buy the store. And he said, what are you going to buy it with? And he said, I will pay you back every week. And Benny sold him the store. Now, you didn't buy the store. You bought the rights to pay the rent for the store. It was a little taxpayer on 174th Street. And my father went to work there. And, of course, we all moved into 2 rooms behind the store. You'd go from the store to these 2 back rooms. There was a landlady on top. And there was an entrance to her apartment. And my sister and brother were sent to school, to yeshivot, and I was sent to the public school on the corner. There wasn't enough money. And so I started in public school. And my parents had to stay in the store. And the reason was because my mother started to break down. She became psychotic. No one understood them. They didn't speak English. The ambulance would show up and put her into one of those white jackets. She was taken to Bellevue. It was really quite terrible. And thank goodness we had customers in the store who quickly tried to get us help and, try to get a Jewish doctor and try to get someone who might be able to tell us what's going on. And the treatment at the time was electroshock therapy. And that's the way she was treated. It wasn't the way they do it today. It was terrifying. It was painful. She was misdiagnosed, schizoaffective disorder. Then it turned out she had bipolar disorder. No one knew. We didn't know, And finally we got help, and they sent her to a sanitarium in Riverdale, which was not far from where we were living. Well, there were several breakdowns of this kind. And even after my sister got married, when my sister got married, just before she got married, my parents had been working in this store. They had enough money with cousins from like the other side of my aunt's family, her husband's family. They bought this little 3-apartment house, and, we had moved there. And, it was an amazing resilience to go there, get so far. But my mother, who held it together all those years, given her early trauma herself in her life, given the trauma of the war, given losing a sister, losing a baby, given the terror of our own escape and fears. And, I can't compare it to what people went through, in the Shoah and the camps. And to some degree, that's why I didn't think of myself as a survivor. I absorbed the emotion, I absorbed the fear, I'm sure I absorbed the terror, but I didn't understand it. And I didn't really remember it. I actually went into hypnosis to try to retrieve early memories. But it wasn't until I was about 5. I don't remember escaping Romania, or the barn or any of that. I just heard the stories. But I never heard anything from my mother. And these psychotic episodes, continued, and there was more shock therapy. My role was to plead with her. There was one time she was in the bedroom, threatening to jump off the roof. It was a 3-story high building. But just suffering so much. And no, she didn't want to, and she didn't want to. She knew they would be coming for her, to take her back to the hospital. And I would go in and plead, we need you, we're your children, we love you. And then, of course, no, they won't come, they won't take you away. And they came. And actually, from that time, I became very much part of her care, I went up and I took food. My sister was married. She was out of the home already. And I took food up to the sanitarium. And later, when they started treating her as an outpatient, I went with, my father would usually take her, and then I would take her for these treatments. One of the offices was on 34th Street, and she'd be lying prone on the ground. No, don't take me, don't force me. And we had this whole ritual, We took the subway and went down, town, and then my father would stop at Horton Hearted and get coffee and make sure they gave it to us in a glass cup because we couldn't use their dishes. And we would take, some cake, some Danish from the store. But the store actually was one of my mother's lifesavers because it was the only thing she could do. She worked in a market. She could sell. People would come in, they didn't speak English, and they'd take them by the hand, show us, what you want. And each time she got a little better. And thank goodness, it was in the early 60s that medication finally came out. It was called Thorazine, chlorpromazine, and that's when the shock treatments, stopped. And that did make a difference. But my mother, the only thing I ever heard her do that showed some warmth or affection was sing lullabies. The very lullaby we now sing to our grandchildren. But, she worked hard. This is an office, a store, you get up at 6 and you close at 10. Even on Saturday nights it would open. And she was great at numbers. You'd write the numbers down on the paper bags, and and she knew how to help my father in the store. And he would have moved on, I'm sure, to other things, but we could not leave her alone. As I mentioned on the trips, I stayed with her. We had a cousin who helped us a great deal. My aunt helped a little bit because she's the one who, she bought the furniture for our house and she bought us the dishes to eat from. I had very mixed feelings about her. And, this was the sad part. When we came to America, my mother had 2 Lachter, 2 silver candlesticks. That's what she was able to save because they were in our suitcases, not on the train, and gave them to my aunt. And many years later, my aunt came to my father and said, "Do you want your candlesticks? How much will you give me for them?" And my father was so hurt. He wouldn't buy them. And I have spent much of my life looking for those candlesticks. If you look in there, you'll see I have many because I remembered them. And then, actually later, I bought my mother a candelabra in Europe on the way back from Israel 1 year. But the store, my father was very smart. He learned the ropes. He learned how to negotiate, the price of milk. It was very competitive kind of business. This was a tiny store. It wasn't as big as this room. And then they decided to build the Cross Bronx Expressway. And our store came down. And our home came down. And what do we do? My father had a dream. My father believed in dreams. And the dream said, go across the street. There's an appetizing store there. Go and tell the man about your dream and say, if you sell me your store, you will have a long life and be healthy. You know what? The man sold him the store. So here we were across the street. They couldn't run an appetizing store bit by bit. I remember trying to slice Nova logs. But here was another amazing story. While they were building the Cross Bronx Expressway, you all know it, I'm sure. Well, there were thousands of workers. And they needed to eat lunch. And, there were no McDonald's and whatever, Subways or anything. Where do you go? You find a store that has food, and they started to come asking for ham and cheese sandwiches. Well, we would not sell ham and cheese sandwiches. My father was a very pious man, and we had to do this. We had to figure it out. And he came up with this remarkable solution. We would get packets of cheese, slice them, in little piles. And then we had another slicing machine, and we would slice bologna, kosher bologna. And then we would have these amazing rolls, because they came from Brooklyn, from Williamsburg, delicious rolls, the big Kaiser rolls. And they would come in and ask for a sandwich. And we would take this packet and that packet and the roll and put it in a bag. And they loved it. And that's when we started to make money and save money. That's how my father could go to Israel and help his family and sold. And of course, with it, you sold a drink. Or you sold a Danish, and then he learned what kind of pastries. They didn't know about these beautiful Danish, right? They wanted jelly donuts and donuts. And the store had that stuff. You know, the store did not sell anything unkosher. There were things that, like Hostess cupcakes and, double dogs and stuff, that weren't kosher, but, they were packaged and all that. They weren't treif. They weren't, not kosher. And so they worked in this store, and of course, Bronx was built. Unfortunately, with the Cross Bronx came the evacuation of this wonderful neighborhood in the Bronx. It was a Jewish neighborhood. There were little shuls almost in every other block. There was a big shul. There was a local hospital. And the Jews started to leave. The neighborhood started to change. And one day, 2 guys came in. My mother was in the front of the store. My father was in the back. Just dealing with the merchandise. He learned to go to auctions and just buy these boxes and, would really be able to buy groceries, for pennies versus, the regular stores. He made deals with, what milk he'd carried or what bread he'd carry. He was very resourceful. But they came in and they said, "Hand it over." My mother thought it was a gun, a toy gun. She, like her mother, wouldn't part. And my father heard the ruckus, and he came in and he sees these 2 guys, and he starts to yell at her in Hungarian. That was their common language. Yiddish was the family language. And he ran over and he said, take it all, take what you want. And they did, and thank God they left. Now, some of the money was hidden in paper bags underneath the counter because you didn't keep that much money in the register. That was it. The next day, my father went to look for another store. And, through his connections and the auctions and this, that, he heard of one across the street from Montefiore Hospital on Gun Hill Road, Bainbridge Avenue. And he bought that little grocery store. And as soon as we could, we moved. And our partners, this cousin I was telling you about, her name was Sura. She became one of my mothers. She was, she was on the marchers. She escaped Auschwitz. Her father was one of those men who came to America and said, "I can't bring this family to the Goyish America, they'll stop being Jews." Lost the family. She survived. She married a man, Misha Grossman, who was actually among the people hiding in the woods and fighting back. What are they called? Partisans. They got married in Germany. They had a little boy. And they came and they moved into the 2 rooms of my aunt's house because it was their uncle. And then 10 years later, we were able to buy this little house together. And a terrible tragedy occurred. She had another child. And this little boy, they lived on the 3rd floor. We lived on the 2nd. We rented the 1st. And the school bus, was coming to take them, to school. And the little boy fell off the steps and the bus ran over him. His name was Ruve. And believe it or not, she survived that. During the Shiva, she found out she was pregnant. And she had 1 more child. And she never separated from him until after high school. She had strength like I know of no other. And we were very close. And she helped us in the store when my mother was sick. She'd go. There were days she was the only one in the store. It didn't matter what anything cost. "What do you want? How much do you pay for it? Take it." When my father would have to go with my mother to the hospital or to these treatments. And she was the one who, I must have been 10 or more. We had never gone to a dentist. She was the one who took me to a dentist. My teeth were totally impacted. And, as I moved ahead, and I'll come to that, but I moved ahead and And we were still living, in the Bronx, in that house on Monroe Avenue. My mission was, as I said, I went to Israel. I wanted to know the truth. I wanted to, learn Torah. I wanted to learn about this faith that allowed people to survive. I knew that many didn't, and it didn't matter, But I just felt there was something I had to understand better that I wasn't learning in America. It didn't work out so well because it was also the years I was going to school, and, I learned Hebrew, and I didn't understand what was happening on because I saw other girls going to another building. And they were Sephardi. They were Sephardic Jews. And I said, why are they going there? Well, they don't have to study the way we do. They have their own schools. They're learning how to sew. They're learning how to cook. So what are you talking about? I came from America. Well, discrimination was going on here too. But I was so horrified to come to Israel, which was gathering all the Jews from everywhere. And there was only one token girl in my class. She was Yemenite. And of course, she became my best friend. And it was horrible because it was also in my family. I remember I started going to her home. That's when I discovered mangoes and guavas and artichokes and food like I've never tasted before. It isn't that Hungarian food isn't good, but... And one day I said, I want to stop in and see my grandmother who was living in my uncle's place, one of my uncles. He had a little house, again, with trees. It was before B'nai Brak was built up. It was, it was where there were still orchards and stuff. And he saw me walk in with her. And he said, never come here again with her. I mean, quietly. You know what? I never went back to him. I mean, later, I did, because then he wanted my grandmother to leave his house, and I went to fight for her. But I became a fighter. And it was terrible. So I quit that school. And I started to stay with my aunt in Tel Aviv. I had an aunt and uncle. This was my father's youngest brother, who went to Israel in 1936. And they took me in. I mean, I just went back and forth because I was still with my grandmother. But I said, okay. And they would just open Tel Aviv University, and they were giving night classes. And I said, okay, I'll take a class. So I did. I hadn't graduated high school, but I did take a class. And then I heard my mother was ill again. So I was lost. This was the only world I knew. I came back to America. It was on the ship, 2 weeks crossing the ocean on SS. It was either Zion or Israel. I have pictures. That's when we stopped in Naples, and I bought my mother candlesticks. And I went back, actually, to the school I had gone to the seminary. But I went back to the teacher's part, to train to be a teacher. Took 1 year, and I knew what I was missing. And I decided, but I got a job. I was teaching in a school on the West Side, 3rd grade, making $30 a week. And I wanted to learn more. So I went to YU, which had a teacher's institute. And, oh my gosh, they welcomed me with open arms. Somebody was, abdicating and coming to YU. And it was great because when I got my teacher's certificate from there, I made $150 a week. So I got a license. And then, of course, that was the beginning. And I decided, okay, I have to go get my diploma. I had a bachelor's of Hebrew letters before I had a high school diploma. I mean, I wasn't given it because I didn't go to college yet. And this is how I got my diploma. Of course, they were very upset because I left the school. And I actually and a few friends left at the time, but one went to England, and I went to Israel. And I found out before I left that if I take the New York Regents exams and you get more than 75, guess what? You don't have to take the course. I took the Regents, and I had taken it before I left. And I don't know. I mean, pleading didn't seem to help. What do you need it for? Why do you want to go to college? All this kind of thing. Even though the assistant principal was a woman who went to college herself. She was the daughter of a very famous rabbi and then went to a school in Israel. And I said, well, if you don't give me my degree, my diploma, I'm going to tell everyone what I did. They gave me the diploma. I ran to Hunter College office, and there was this lovely woman, Mrs. Katz, and I told her my story. And I said, can I start taking classes at night? Well, everybody had applied. She was amazing. I showed her the diploma, and I don't know what she did, but I started taking classes at night. I continued teaching to make money. We still didn't have that much. I lived with my parents, and I spent the next 6 years getting a degree. And I majored in psychology, art, and the mattress courses. Did you ever hear of the mattress courses? These are the courses that you took, 12 credits in education, so you could have something to fall back on. And a lot of people were doing it. 12 credits, you can go work for the public schools and teach. And then you would work your way into whatever they required. So I went down to college, and then I switched to City College because I had a better psych department. I was so unprepared. The only person I knew who went to college was my sister's husband. He too, he was a Polish refugee, an amazing man. He and his family escaped through Siberia. His mother died there, and he had sisters, and he landed up in an orphanage right outside of Paris. And he was very smart. He actually started to take courses at the Sorbonne. He knew 7 languages. He knew Russian and Hebrew and English and Yiddish and Polish, and was amazing. And one of his sisters got to America, one got to Israel, then another 2 got to America, and they brought him to America. And he was studying at the yeshiva. He went to night high school. He went to City College and became an engineer. And then he went to Columbia and got a master's. Well, he was the only one. So what should I study? I'm going to study engineering. And I took a class in calculus, but I never took advanced geometry. No, I took that, but I never took I took beginners and geometry, but I never took advanced. Well, it was ridiculous. I was in night school, and there too, I was so lucky. There was this nice Jewish guy teaching the course at night, and I froze. Joe started to tutor me, and I tried to memorize it, but I couldn't do it. And I told him my story, and he said, just do the best you can. Don't worry. And he gave me a C, and I passed. But that was it. I never went near science again. Although I did take a chemistry course because I needed the reagents. And we hired a teacher from Beis Yaakov, where I was going. And I'd leave the Bronx 6:30 in the morning, and he taught us a group of about 5 girls. We sat around the table to learn chemistry. No labs, no test tubes, no nothing. I memorized it all. And I passed the Regents. So I never went, I took physiology, I took geology. At any rate, I decided at that point, I wanted to be more. And I became a school psychologist. And I never got there. But I had to do an internship for that. You had to do a 3-month internship. I couldn't find a job. I was working in Elmhurst Hospital, right here. It was an amazing experience. They had a women's prison. They had adolescents. They had everything. It was an active city hospital. And I just was learning so much. And I was supposed to leave in September. And the person who was coming to do an internship, who was a doctoral student, didn't show up. And these doctoral internships that were approved by the APA, that's the American Psychology Association, were very hard to come by. And I went to the head of the department. I said, you don't want to lose this scholarship, this internship. Can I have it? Well, she knew my work for 3 months, and she didn't want to lose it. And if no one filled it, she would lose it. I got it. I did my internship. I applied to 3 doctoral programs. I got into the #1 program in New York City. Went back to school. And I went to them, and here was another lucky connection. You see, this all has to do with my people seeing me as a survivor in a way. And I was interviewed by this woman, Mary Engel, and Jerry Singer. He was very famous. He actually went to Yale shortly afterwards. And she was a Hungarian survivor. And they accepted me. And I said, oh, but do I have to do another internship? And they said, we'll see. Well, there were difficulties, but not only did I get in, I got a job with her husband who was doing a big study in Montefiore in child psychiatry. That's what I did my own dissertation on. And there were complications and delays. And finally, I said, well, will you accept my internship? And they did. So I finished so quickly. And I was 27, 28 at the time. And it was delayed a little bit because Mary Engel had a breakdown. But I was on the New York route. I was going to do a postdoc. I got into Harvard. I got into Yale. Guess what? I was going to Israel. So I went. So that's what I did. I went on a trip. I took the journey back through the journey coming to America. On the way, I stopped in Spain and Morocco. But I love to travel. I love visiting the Jewish communities. I love meeting people, who are around. And it was this Sarah Grossman who helped me, just like she took me to my first dentist. She also came down and washed the dishes and helped clean the apartment while I was in school, so I had time to do my homework. And she was remarkable. I mean, despite her tragedies, one after another, she still had what to give. And then when I started going to Israel, so this was 1960. It was just when I quit high school, and I met 2 of my other aunts, my uncles. I met everybody. I mean, that's all I wanted to do, is meet people and talk and hear their stories. And they also adopted me. It was really wonderful, and that grew over time. So by the time I finished school, my grandmother had died. One was still alive. And while I was a student, Hadassah, Hadassah Hospital, Hadassah Women of America, I forget, but, they gave me scholarships to go work there in the summer. So I was there after the 6-Day War. I worked in child psychiatry at Hadassah. I went for 3 years. I lived in the dorms with the medical students. And I could just push away all this pressure I had. You're not married, you're not married, you're not married. You're too smart, you're too this. And I just kept going. So when I graduated, I went back to Arad. And Olga, this woman, this gentle, this righteous Gentile I told you about, she was still there. We were sending her packages of food. And, I just had a little postcard. And I stopped in Vienna. I had to get all these visas to go through Hungary and to go through Czechoslovakia, to go through Romania. And I sent her a postcard. I'll be arriving this week. But I wasn't sure when. I was alone at that point. It was a little scary, going on these trains. I was a young, lovely young woman, and carrying my suitcase, carrying money to give. And I got off at the train station. And I see the same train station that we arrived at to leave out at. And I see women calling out, Surika, Surika, Surika. And Olga was there with one of her neighbors, waiting for every train that arrived that week. And that's how we reunited. So she threw her husband out. She didn't have children. And I moved into her little room. The Russians, the communists weren't very, kind to people back then. And I slept with her, and she took me to the police station because I had to register. And she introduced me to my family, because she knew them and I didn't. And I had a cousin there, Rosie, who actually stayed in Romania. She was the mistress of a doctor who protected her. And she stayed. She eventually became the leader of the Jewish community, years after the war. And, and I was able to go to the cemetery, and we planned our trip to go back to Barsha. But, and she bought new pots and pans, and there was an old Jewish home there, for the aged, and I'd go there every day to eat, and it was like amazing, just amazing. And, it was very poor. The stores were such a friend. You'd see a few cans in the window, but I had dollars, and I was a tourist, so I could buy food. And Olga, she knew how to cross into Yugoslavia and trade my money and get more money, and started to bring back, food, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, you name it. And so it was amazing. And then we went to the bathhouse because she didn't have a shower or a bathroom or, She slipped and broke her leg. And that was the end of my trip to Barsha. I spent 2 weeks with her going to this hospital, and I said, oh my God, if anything would happen to me, I have to go. I have to leave. I couldn't go to Barsha myself. It wasn't safe. This was 1972. It was the dark days of communism. And she, of course, understood. I mean, I'd go into these wards, and they'd have one thermometer and, full of people. And it's like the Solzhenitsyn stories. It was like, and I actually flew to Bucharest. I had a cousin there. I spent a little time there till I could. And, I met her, visiting the sites, going to the shul, things like that. And I flew to Israel and stayed. And I was very lucky. I was invited to be the chief psychologist. It was a little ridiculous. But there was a hospital there for the ill people, many from the war. It was called Ezrat Nashim. It was started by the grandmother of the current president of Israel, Herzog. And she was a remarkable woman. And okay, all right. But actually, what happened was an American psychiatrist, Rosenbaum, who had worked at Einstein, had moved to Israel. And he said, we need a community mental health program. And he helped them start this program in northern Jerusalem. My training included community mental health. My dissertation was on first-time Black mothers here in Harlem. And I walked the streets and visited, always with another person, with a social worker who came with me, so it would be safe. So, okay. What had already started in Israel at the time were these clinics called Tipot Chalav, drops of milk. And these were mother-child, mother-baby programs, that were providing the inoculations and the well visits. And so they were scattered. And this program was in northern Jerusalem. And that's how we started this community program. I went and I met with parents, I met with the nurses. When I was at Hadassah, I was doing a lot of assessments, so I learned to do that very quickly. On the American test, they ask, who was Christopher Columbus? And on the Israeli test version of it, they say, who was Moses? That was really interesting. There were a lot of things that happened then. And then we went into the community centers, and then we finally opened an office. And then a week from now will be the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And I was recruited by the Army, and I worked for the Army, visiting families of soldiers, reserve soldiers who had children 6 and under, to provide support. I mean, they were so ahead of the time in providing mental health services. And, you know, I was lucky. I didn't have a father in the Army. I didn't have a brother in the Army. I didn't have a son in the Army. So I was like more available to absorb this terrible period of the war. When the war broke out, I was in Netanya with one of my adopted mothers, actually the mother of one of her sons who became the head of Yeshivat HaKotel. And I was sleeping late, and I heard the sirens, and I hear planes, and I was still in bed, and I ran to find my aunt to bring her back. And we came back, and, you know, the shelters were full of junk and stuff, and you know, you turned the radio on and all you heard were these funny statements. The cows are in the meadow. You know, so-and-so is thirsty at, you know, the name of the street. All these code words. Of course, there were no phones. How are you going to reach these soldiers? They had to come. And my 2 cousins were already in the Army. One of them had served in the 6-Day War. The other one, you know, served afterwards. And they came running. And my father was in Israel because when he couldn't pray anymore and be the Chazan, he started coming to spend every high holiday with the Rebbe. So he came running back. He was one was in Bnei Brak, the other was in Haifa. He had a ticket to return the next day because he couldn't leave my mother alone. And the war started. I don't know. Well, you'll be hearing a lot about it because it's the 50th anniversary. There's going to be a lot of stories. And they just opened the records on what really happened. Golda Meir was the prime minister. And I just have to give my father tremendous credit because at that point, Israel was mobilizing. All the planes were emptied of seats within 48 hours because they had to come to America to get help, to get arms. And I remember saying to my father, you have to go. I'm taking you to the airport. I worked in Jerusalem. And we drove in the blackout to the airport, and it was crowds, and I made sure he got on the plane. He never asked me to come with him. He knew I wouldn't. And I got back into a taxi, and I went to Jerusalem. Started to work. And I mean, this took over everything. You know, there was the only thing we had to do then, was, visit these families. For some, they had to wait 8-9 months till they knew their husbands, they were missing in action. One of my cousins was captured by the Egyptians in the war, and he and his troop were taken, across the Nile. And we have pictures of him carrying the Sefer Torah with him. And then, of course, in the exchange, he came back and he went to live on a kibbutz. And, they were just unbelievable times. The Army gave me a pass. I could take any car, any taxi, go anywhere, anytime, any hour. And finally, when the war was over, we started groups for children. We started groups for the siblings. I was supervising students at the university, who came to do these groups. And I continued to work until I myself felt like a widow, for about 3 years. And I decided to come back to America. Mostly, it was because I wanted to get married. I needed to make space for a life of my own. There weren't many men around in Israel after that war. So my parents came to Israel. This is when they sold the third store and packed up and made Aliyah. Another miracle. The store was sold, and they were to hand it over to this Indian family the next day. But my mother wouldn't leave the store because Sunday was our big day of business. You know, other stores weren't open. That's when you came to a small grocery. Our best days were Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and all. And so my father, she was very adamant. My father listened. And the next day, the keys were given over, the store was held up, and the man who bought the store was shot. I mean, there is something called in Hebrew hashgacha pratit, that somewhere we had a special protection. Hashgacha is like protections. You know, someone is looking out for you, this private source. Because as you can see, I keep talking about these miracles. So I stayed. I helped my parents buy an apartment. They bought one for me too, but I never got to live there, you know, and helped them through all the bureaucracy and the paraphernalia, and they got settled. And these were, you know, just magical days. And some of my father's brothers were living there. And for my mother, it was amazing because my mother always loved to swim. She liked it. It's going through Romania is a very big river called the Marișca, I think, something like that. And so they moved to Netanya. It was near the beach. And the medication was working for her. You know, she didn't speak Hebrew, but she was calmer and went to family events. For Shabbat, they would travel to the Rebbe, you know, 2 buses, you know, schlepping their chicken soup. And those were the good years. It was the best years my parents had until my mother fell in her own house, in the kitchen. It's kind of a paradox. That's how I fell in Israel when I fractured my femur. She broke her hip. My father couldn't believe it. He started schlepping her on the kitchen cloth. She finally was taken to a hospital, had a blood clot, and could not be operated, and on and on and on. So she suffered terribly for a few years. And they had to wait until this blood situation was resolved. It was too dangerous back then. They waited for the clot to go away, and she was taken to Malbin. It's a system of homes in Israel for elderly people and sick people and senile people. And they put her in this ward of 10 beds, and I walked in there. Nope. She didn't speak Hebrew. She was in pain. She couldn't communicate. And I went to the director of the program. I learned from my father. I handed him my video camera. That was a hard thing to have in those days. I handed him $1,000. I said, "You move my mother today." And he moved her to a nice small house. They were like small buildings. She was still with 3 other women. But they were nice and they were kind, and she got therapy and, you know, PT, and I had time to make arrangements, you know, for her to be transferred to Ichilov, Tel Aviv, you know, the big hospital, for surgery through a connection. My husband's cousin's husband was a big doctor there. And then she came back here and she had surgery again, and she became, you know, declined cognitively. You know, another hospital, and then she broke her ankle and just started to suffer so much. So she had help at the time, you know. Israel, I don't know if you know about elderly care in Israel, but they hire people to stay and keep people in the homes to take care of you. And she had this lovely Russian woman, but she didn't live with them. And I saw my mother was declining, and I had to arrange for someone to live there. I was in America. I started to travel with my passport in my bag. You know, I went every single month. And I said, "We are going to find someone." You won't believe it. It was another one of these things. This woman calls me up. She's Romanian. She speaks English fluently. She was sleeping on someone's couch. She needed a job. I said, "Can you come today?" I propped my mother up, dressed her up. I put out like some dominoes and, I helped my father. I fixed the apartment up. I didn't want her to know how disabled my mother was. And she comes and she speaks English, and she was, an educated woman from Romania. She had come, like with many people, to work, but she was between jobs. She desperately needed a place to be. And right in the middle of the visit, my mother has an ischemic attack. That's a mini stroke. So I turned to her and I said, I didn't know what was happening. I'd never seen one up close. I said, could you please stay here until I come back? And she did, and she never left until both my parents died. She was my angel, of mercy. And it was, it was kind of the beginning of the end of my mother's life. So her name is Elena. Her name is Elena. She stayed with us, and through my father. My mother died at 87. My father was 5 years old and lived another 5 years after that, and died close to his 86th birthday. And he always told me again and again, the Rebbe promised him a long life. When he was forced to join the army, he said, don't worry, you'll never have to serve a day. And he never did. On that table is a picture of him in uniform. And so it was. He really suffered. He had, some skin cancer from the sun. He broke his arm. He fell too. He got tired. He really got tired of life. I was coming, every month at that time. I would leave my family and go there for the holidays and go there for Pesach. And what was wonderful is my children started to go study in Israel. So they took over the job. My brother had 2 sons who went, and I had my son and my daughter who went. And at the time, 3 of them went, and every week someone else would go for Shabbat. And they took turns. My son studied in Israel for 3 years, and he's now a teacher. He teaches in the Rabbinical School of YU, and he also teaches in the college. He studied for many years. Before we went to Israel, we were my husband is a lawyer, a graduate of Harvard, comes from a totally different background in American life. He does have his own story. And we told Nathaniel he had to sign an agreement to go to college. So he did. And he came back, and he didn't want to go to college, but he did. And in a year, he graduated, first in his class at YU. And at the graduation, there was a ceremony. And this was he handed me 5 plaques of honors for his studies at YU. And he said, he's majored in economics. He said, Ima, this is for you. I'm not going to spend my life worrying and making money. Well, that's come true. It's really come true. He continued to study. He got married to a young woman, and also very dedicated. She's a Judaic teacher. They lived up in the Heights, and my father made it to that wedding, and then and my daughter got married later in the same year, thank God. And my father made it to my daughter's wedding. My mother was still alive when my son got married, but then she died, and she was buried on Mount of Olives in the spaces my father got, and as was my father later on. My daughter had a little boy who's now a junior at YU, college. And I said, Rachel, you're coming to Israel with your baby, just like I took my son when he was just 3 months old to meet my family. And they wouldn't let her come into the ward. My father was at that point in the hospital already. He was in and out of hospitals. And what do you mean you're not letting my daughter in with the baby? No, it's the rule. We can't do it. And I had protectia in that hospital. One of my colleagues who became my best friend, her brother-in-law was the head of the hospital, and I couldn't swing it. So, in a quiet moment, I took my father's bed. I wheeled it out of the unit into the hall so he could meet my grandson. It was amazing. And the baby was just at his best. Singing and clapping. He was 8 or 9 months old. So you could see there's the impact of my own childhood where I absorbed all that trauma. I had a mother who could never talk, could never answer a question. I tried often, again and again, to ask her things gently, and her eyes would glaze over. And that was the sign she was breaking down. We would back off and leave her alone. I had her, she got to see my grandchildren. My parents would come and visit. Not my grandchildren, my children. They'd come visit. They came twice a year in the beginning, and then once a year, and then we always went to see them, and then they couldn't come anymore. But I learned her lullabies, and she sang a beautiful song that women say at the end of the Sabbath. And in those moments, she'd be very different. But, she had her life. She loved going to bazaars, right? The marketplace. She loved finding bargains. If you look around, you can see so did I as I traveled the world. She worked hard. She cooked for us. Of course, my little brother became the favorite son and the favorite child. But he, I would say he was quite depressed. He still is. His whole life he was very subdued. But Vietnam came along, so he went to YU. He also became a rabbi. He was an assistant rabbi at the shul we now go to for a while. Then moved to Brooklyn and became a nursing home supervisor. And he has 5 children. They have children, and they've done well. My sister, after I went to school and she saw I was going, actually went and got her high school diploma, started going to college at night. She became a special ed teacher and a supervisor. She worked, in Bed-Stuy. And she just fought for her students to, take them off the special ed list. And then, but she was different. My sister recorded her story for the Shoah. I listened to it, and I didn't know we were in the same family. My sister was 10. She was social. She absorbed my father's love of people. She, there were these youth organizations when we came here. She started to work. She also worked, in a nursery school and things like that till she got her degree. She married Joe, who was an amazing man, as I told you, who, became the engineer. But he was a quiet man. He became the gabbai in his shul. He and my sister were, just very different. But she remembered, no, we were never hungry in Romania. No, it was fine. We weren't taken away during the war. No, my father was so smart. And I listened to that tape again and again. And how fortunate she was, because this didn't happen until she was 10. So she did have those good years, the better times. She would tease me, oh, I had to put my doll's clothes on you because you were so small. She didn't remember much about my brother. But she focused on the positive. She was a much more positive thinker. And we're very different. I was very quiet and subdued. Can you pause?
We can take a break. So we're back from a break. and you're going to sort of sum up your whole experience.
Right. Well, I was starting to tell you about, my children and kind of my parents and what happened. And actually, I'm very happy because they did see me marry at 33. I met Jonathan through good friends when I went down to visit them in Silver Spring. And we've been married. We got married in 1977. And so there were these just two aspects, There was the horror of the Holocaust. I always felt I was a witness to it, if not in it directly. But obviously the reverberations of all the trauma. And my mother was the secret victim. My father got a pension from the Germans for being in the war very late in the game, but he got one. He was acknowledged. He's on the list. Even my sister benefited. I won't apply. I won't go to Germany. I won't buy anything German. Thank God I don't need it. And so that trauma was absorbed. And unlike my sister, who, thank God, found some joy in her childhood and in her life, before she herself started to decline. My grandmother was senile. My mother had dementia. My sister has dementia. I'm hoping it'll pass me by. And, but there's a story of faith, this story of hope, the story of resilience. When I think about my father, who could share love, who could use the word love, who always said that if you honor your mother and father and your parents, you'll have a long life. It was the example he set for me in taking care of his mother, our mothers, our grandmothers. It was the path I followed. So, there are always two sides. His faith and my connection to my Hasidic family continues to this day. I became close to them when I went in 1960 as a young girl. And I'm accepted. I kind of obviously left that fold. I've stayed observant. I still keep kosher. My children are far more religious than I am. And, I want to share in their joys. I go to their weddings. And it's part of my life. That's what bears witness to where I came from. And I did have a third child. And as she says, she's differently abled. You can see some of her story in these paintings. It's not been an easy life. Oh my gosh. I don't know. And she's turning 40 this year. I'm turning 80. She was born right after I turned 40. And just hope we'll have more years.
Well,
to keep transmitting this story. I always told the story from a young age of Prague. I mean, what could convey values more than that? I always told him those stories. But I told him bits and pieces, in these fragments. But I'm really happy I had the opportunity to do this because it's a record I'll give to them. I hope I'll write my story, I hope I'll list all those people and write their names. I managed to make it in that outer world and achieve things that I'm very grateful because it was to help other children.
Yeah.
And the program is successful. I started a big program in Israel. I started a program in Lakewood. I've trained thousands of people. To work developmentally. The approach I use is called parent mediation. Because, yes, we treat the children too, but the whole idea is to treat the parents. to help them. They're the mediators of their children's life. Their therapists won't be around. We come and we go. And it changed the field because it wasn't just mental health, it was interdisciplinary, OTs, PTs, speech people, doctors, neurologists, pediatricians. I mean, everyone to understand the emotional life of children with challenges or mental health challenges. They're not different, they go hand in hand. So, I'll be moving up. I hope people will carry this on. I think they will. I think it'll have a legacy. And, I'm glad I could absorb both sides, appreciate the trauma that many people still live with. I wrote things about refugees. I wrote things about, how you connect when you're the diversity needed when you're helping people that are nothing like you. I kept my story quiet. I felt I needed a boundary for myself in order to work with others without this merging. And I think that was the right choice for me. I think it gave people more confidence. They can tell their stories without worrying about mine. If I needed someone to identify with something, I made it up. So, thank you for this opportunity, What an amazing, opportunity to be filmed doing this. It took me a long time to get here. As I said, I saw myself more and more as a survivor, though, as I got older. That was the reality. So
I'm very grateful
it will
that
be
you
passed
did
on.
choose to share your story. It is a fascinating story of resilience and the enduring trauma that even though you were born in 1943 and the war was over in 1945, you have carried this through until today and how it went for your family. But you also clearly inherited your father's resourcefulness and resilience, and it's an incredible model for your family and everyone else who in the future will get to see this video. So thank you.
Well, no, thank you. I didn't know the worst was yet to come, with my mother. But, there's no question that in my own way, I absorbed my father's faith. So I hope everyone who sees this and other people who, don't have to have this complexity, but, who need support, who need strength, who need hope, will transmit it, to their children.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So tell us about this picture.
Well, this is a picture of my father. He's close to his 90s at this point. And behind it you could see this beautiful candelabra, which he bought on one of his early trips to Israel and had the resources to do so. And I now use it every year as well. And from his smile, you could just see his warmth, and he always had a gleam in his eye. Through thick and thin, he just never lost faith and never lost hope.
Tell me about this photo.
This is a picture of Barsha, the little shtetl, and as you could see, at the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania. And it was taken before it got burned down in a pogrom by a group of university students led by Danilo. And my family, my father was born there and lived there. My grandfather came from a nearby area, but it was it was a big shtetl. It wasn't a small one, unlike the one my mother came from, which had just a few dozen homes. And it's a beautiful area even to this day. And my understanding is it's become a great ski resort.
Thank you. Tell me about this photo.
This is a picture of a woman, Olga Witteken, and she was a righteous Gentile. She helped us through the war. She became a pseudo-partner of my father's, and something very special. She was able to go carrying notes hidden in the braids of my hair that my father wrote, telling the Jews to come to Arad, to come to this side of the border, because the Germans were passing, all these rumors. No, if you go there, you'll get taken away. And the other side was saying, no, if you come here, you'll be taken away. And she was just very brave. She knew how to recognize a Jew and how to give them some warning, but not many did, sadly.
And who are the two in the photo?
Well, that's my sister, Hetty, and that's me. And these are pictures taken after the war. We had our beautiful little sailor uniforms. She was like a member of the family. She lived across the way, and my sister actually lived with her much of the time and slept at her house. But she was there for us in every way, and we tried to be there for her after the war and sent her just the basics of what you needed, food-wise and clothes-wise. And I went to see her, and I got to know her and spent some time with her. But it was in the dark days of Romania in 1972, and sadly she got hurt, and we never took our trip to Barsha.
Thank you. Tell me about this photo.
This is a picture taken in 1937, probably early 1937, when my grandparents decided to go to Israel, having gotten a certificate as a pioneer when it was still possible to enter Palestine that my father gave them. So at the center, you could see my grandfather and my grandmother. He was 23 years older than her, his third wife. And here you will see children of their marriage and a few of the second marriage. Some of the people here perished in the war. If you look at the left-hand corner, there's a woman holding a baby. That's my Uncle Lizer. And she and his 5 children perished in Auschwitz. And he rebuilt his life, got married. He has 3 sons, the youngest of whom is the head of the Yeshivat HaKotel. Next to him is a cousin. He was from the second marriage, Avram Alter. He was older than his nieces and nephews. A wonderful man. And my father is in the center there, right behind his father. Next to him, his youngest brother. And next to him, a brother-in-law. And the one wearing the hat with the beard. And in front of him is his wife, Ita, a sister of my father. And those 2 little children were her children. They also perished in the war. They were also taken away, and separated, but they both perished, both parents. In the far corner, on the right, is my Uncle Mendel and Sura. They too were in Auschwitz. They survived, but he never recovered. Somehow, his job was to take the bodies and put them into the ovens. And yet, they both made it. They lived in Bnei Brak. There is now a synagogue on their property in their honor. They never had any children. Built by some cousins who took care of them when they were old. And last, if you go back to the left, there's another sister, and her son, he's the brother of the tall man next to my father, and they had 5 or 6 children. They actually were able to flee and took the other route through Kazakhstan, and she died on the way, but the children made it. And they had one son who came to Israel. He was only 17, and he fought in the Independence War. He was captured and suffered terribly. But the rest of the family thrived in that a few had children, and so those are in this picture.
Thank you.
But we had many, many family that were lost. And it was just so fortunate my grandfather got to Israel, and that whoever made it there before or after the war, was alive and well.
Yes, thank you. Tell me about this photo.
This is actually one of the women we just saw, my father's sister. This was in Barsha. It actually gives you a better picture of what life there was like, how poor they were, the broken fences. And she had these 2 beautiful children. And it's amazing there's a photo. But they too perished in Auschwitz.
Thank you. Tell me about this photo.
This is my mother's mother. Her name was Rosa. Rosa, which means rose. That was a very popular name. In World War I, she was married, and her husband was picked up to be a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was also towards the end of the war that the Spanish flu occurred, and 4 of these children died. 1 little girl survived. And her husband, who I guess was a soldier until he died, also got the flu, and he also died. So she was a very courageous woman who left with the 1 daughter, and then my mother, who was born after her father died, and was just an infant, and had to find a way to care for them and raise them, and moved to Arad, and that's how we got to Arad. She moved to Arad and, slept on the floor, and finally found some work selling geese. And she was a good cook. She also then started to sell food in a little bodega in their courtyard. And she wouldn't leave with us when we left Arad. She stayed there, but eventually was brought to Israel in the 50s among the people who were bought out. And, I guess lived for another 8 years or so. The separation from my mother was utterly traumatic. My mother had never spent a day without being with her mother. And yet my grandmother released her to leave when we had to get away from the communists, and was part of the beginning of my mother's breakdowns. So, you try to survive, and you struggle, and she just couldn't do it anymore.
Thank you. Tell me about these photos.
Well, these are photos in America. As I shared with you, my father got a grocery store. You see it there in the background. In the corner, you can see one of those old, beautiful registers. And he and my mother worked in this store. We lived behind this store for years. And I went to school in the public school, and I would hide underneath the counter because I was afraid the teacher might walk in and see what I was eating for lunch. And you don't eat challah and sour cream for lunch. So I'd go to school and she'd say, "What do you have for lunch?" And I'd point to the posters. And there's another one, I'm not sure why, someone caught this picture. You can see it was just a little store. He's picking something up. That must have been one of our customers. And they worked for 27 years in America in these stores. Then went to Israel, and my mother lived about 22 years longer. She was only 57. And my father was 62, and he just went to the Social Security office. He couldn't work anymore. They couldn't stand on their feet anymore. And he was able to get a disability. So he got early Social Security, at the full rate, and lived for 28 more years in Israel until he was almost 96. But those grocery stores, all three of them, were a lifeline for us.
Thank you. Tell me about this photo.
This photo was taken in 1957 at my sister's wedding. It was on a pouring, rainy Saturday night. And you see my father, her husband, Yaina, or Jonas, Hetty. She was only 18 years old. My mother got married at 18. My grandmother got married at 18. And there's my mother. We were all outfitted by my aunt, and had a real photographer. And there's my brother. He was sick during the whole wedding. And that's me in the center. I remember that beautiful light green dress. And they got a little cape, so it should be tznius, it should be modest. And my mother, looks good. This was a period between her breakdowns, and it was a happy night. My parents were very comfortable with her marrying a European, marrying a survivor. So they each had their own stories. And he died after they were married for 40 years. He had cancer. We never really knew how old he was. When the refugees came here, they would never tell their true age. They didn't know if it would be better to be older or younger. And, and he's still very missed to this day. But he has 2 children. His son is taken care of, Hetty. I go see her every week. So I have to tell her story now for her.
Thank you.
So this is the final photo.
Yep. I'm happy to say these are our grandchildren, 13 of the 15. And the photo was taken in Annapolis, Maryland, at our home. It was a summer weekend. It was all year round. It was a place that we got many years ago to escape to and find quiet and to rest. And the children just love it, and they come every year. During COVID, my daughter lived there, and now they're getting older and older. The first has just gotten off and gone to study in Israel. They're just beautiful and wonderful children. There are 2 more boys born after the ones you see here. Fortunately, we moved to New York to be near them. That's why we're here. And they're nearby. So my daughter is down the street, and my son is in Passaic. And we're just very, very lucky to have them. And I will tell them and let them see all these stories.
Thank you.